What happens when a 12-year-old boy breaks down crying in front of a judge, not because he's guilty, but because his family can't afford a $75 parking ticket that saved his life? A small courtroom in Providence, Rhode Island, where the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across wooden benches worn smooth by decades of anxiety and hope. The air carries that distinctive scent of old building mixed with nervous perspiration. Today, like every other day, people file in with their tickets, their fines, their stories of small mistakes that have somehow snowballed into court appearances. But this isn't just any courtroom. This is the domain of Judge Frank Caprio, a man whose reputation for compassion has spread far beyond the borders of his city, far beyond the confines of municipal court. Here, in this unassuming space, something extraordinary happens daily. Humanity intersects with justice in ways that restore faith in the system. On this particular morning, a 12-year-old boy named Marcus shuffles through the heavy wooden doors, his small hand dwarfed by his grandmother's weathered fingers. His sneakers squeak against the polished floor as he walks down the center aisle, past rows of adults who glance down at him with mixtures of curiosity and sympathy. He's barely tall enough to see over the defendant's podium, his eyes wide with a fear that no child should have to experience. Marcus isn't here for something he did wrong. He's here because of a parking ticket, a simple violation that has somehow become his family's burden to bear. His grandmother, Maria Santos, had received the citation 3 months ago while rushing Marcus to the emergency room during one of his severe asthma attacks. In her panic to get her grandson the medical attention he desperately needed, she had parked illegally outside the hospital. The ticket seemed insignificant compared to Marcus's struggle to breathe, but now, unpaid and accumulating fees, it has brought them before Judge Caprio. The courtroom falls into its familiar rhythm. Cases are called, fines are paid, some are reduced, others dismissed. But when Marcus's case is announced, something shifts in the atmosphere. The boy approaches the bench with trembling legs, his grandmother's hand on his shoulder providing what little comfort it can. Judge Caprio, seated behind his bench like a lighthouse of calm in this sea of legal proceedings, notices immediately that this case is different. What happens next challenges everything we think we know about courtrooms, about justice, and about the power of human compassion. Most judges would glance at the paperwork, note the violation, perhaps reduce the fine, and move on to the next case. The system is designed for efficiency, not empathy. But Judge Caprio has never been most judges. As Marcus stands before the bench, barely visible above the wooden barrier that separates the judge from the defendants, his lower lip begins to quiver. The weight of the moment, the formal setting, the adults in suits, the gravity of owing money his family doesn't have becomes too much for his young shoulders to bear. Tears begin to well up in his eyes, and despite his efforts to be brave, to be the man his grandmother needs him to be, his composure crumbles. Judge Caprio watches this unfold with the patience of a man who has seen thousands of cases but never lost sight of the human being behind each one. He doesn't reach for his gavel. He doesn't consult the legal precedents. Instead, he leans forward, his voice softening to a tone more befitting a grandfather than a judge, and asks Marcus a question that no one in that courtroom expected to hear. The question hangs in the air like a bridge between the cold formality of legal proceedings and the warm reality of human connection. In this moment, the courtroom transforms from a place of judgment to a space of understanding, from a venue of punishment to a sanctuary of compassion. Those watching, the court officers who have seen it all, the other defendants waiting their turn, the family members in the gallery, sense that they are about to witness something special. The cameras that normally capture routine proceedings are now recording what will become one of the most shared moments in the history of viral courtroom videos. But this isn't about viral fame or social media moments. This is about a judge who understands that justice without mercy is just sophisticated revenge, and mercy without understanding is just empty gesture. Judge Caprio has built his career and his legacy on the belief that every person who enters his courtroom deserves to be seen, to be heard, and to be treated with dignity. As Marcus struggles to compose himself, wiping his tears with the back of his small hand, the entire courtroom waits in hushed anticipation. What will Judge Caprio say? What will he do? How does the law account for a 12-year-old boy's tears, for a grandmother's impossible choice between her grandson's breathing and a parking meter? No one expected what Judge Caprio would say next, but everyone in that room, and eventually millions around the world, would remember it forever. To understand the depth of what unfolded in Judge Caprio's courtroom that day, you have to understand Marcus Santos and the journey that brought him there. Marcus wasn't just any 12-year-old. He was a boy carrying burdens that would challenge adults twice his age. Born with severe asthma, Marcus had spent more nights in hospital rooms than most children spent at sleepovers. His condition wasn't the mild, manageable asthma that responds well to an inhaler kept in a backpack. This was the kind that could turn a normal Tuesday afternoon into a race against time, where every breath became a conscious effort and every wheeze struck fear into his grandmother's heart. Maria Santos, Marcus's grandmother, had become his primary caregiver after his parents died in a car accident when he was 7. At 68, she found herself navigating the complex world of childhood asthma management while working 2 part-time jobs to keep their small apartment and put food on the table. The medication alone cost more each month than she spent on groceries, even with the insurance she couldn't really afford. The day that brought them to court had started like many others, with Marcus waking up, unable to catch his breath. Maria recognized the signs immediately: the slight blue tinge to his lips, the way his chest worked overtime with each inhalation, the panic in his eyes that came with feeling like he was drowning in air. She had grabbed her keys, scooped Marcus into her 15-year-old Honda, and driven as fast as she dared to Providence General Hospital. In the emergency room parking lot, every space was occupied. Maria could hear Marcus struggling in the passenger seat, could see him fighting for each breath, and the parking regulations became irrelevant in the face of her grandson's crisis. She parked in a fire zone, gathered Marcus in her arms, and ran through the automatic doors into the fluorescent brightness of the emergency room. 3 hours later, after nebulizer treatments and careful monitoring, Marcus was breathing easier. The doctors had stabilized him, adjusted his medications, and sent them home with new instructions and warnings about environmental triggers. It wasn't until Maria was helping Marcus into the car that she noticed the orange ticket tucked under her windshield wiper: a $75 fine for illegal parking. $75 might as well have been $75,000 for Maria Santos. After rent, utilities, groceries, and Marcus's medications, she operated on a budget measured in single digits. The ticket joined a small pile of other bills she couldn't immediately pay, each one representing another choice between necessities. Most judges see parking violations as simple administrative matters. The violation occurred, the fine is owed, payment is expected. It's a system designed for people who have $75 to spare, for people who don't have to choose between medication and electricity, between car insurance and school supplies. But Judge Caprio had built his reputation on understanding that behind every case file is a human story. He had seen enough grandmothers like Maria, enough children like Marcus, to know that sometimes the law needs to bend toward justice rather than insist on rigid compliance. When Maria received the court summons 3 months later, the unpaid ticket had accumulated late fees, bringing the total to $150. She made a decision that revealed everything about her character. She could have come to court alone, could have explained the situation herself, could have shielded Marcus from the stress and formality of legal proceedings. Instead, she brought him with her. "You need to understand," she told him on the bus ride to the courthouse, "that sometimes life puts us in difficult situations, but we face them with dignity. We tell the truth and we hope for understanding." Marcus listened to his grandmother's words, but as they entered the imposing courthouse building, with its marble floors and echoing hallways, the concept of dignity felt fragile in his small hands. This was a world built for adults, with procedures designed around people who understood legal language and court etiquette. Most judges would have processed their case in minutes. The violation was clear, the circumstances irrelevant to the technical question of whether a car was illegally parked. But as Marcus and Maria approached the bench, Judge Caprio saw what the paperwork couldn't capture: a child bearing the weight of circumstances beyond his control, a grandmother who had made an impossible choice out of love, and a family held together by determination, despite being stretched beyond their means. Judge Caprio leaned forward, looking directly at Marcus rather than consulting his computer screen or case file. In that moment, he made a choice that separated him from countless other judges. He chose to see the person before seeing the violation. "Son," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had never forgotten what it felt like to be small and afraid, "I want you to tell me about that day at the hospital." No one expected what Judge Caprio would say next, but his decision to listen first and judge second was about to transform a routine parking violation into a lesson about compassion that would resonate far beyond that Providence courtroom. The courtroom held its collective breath as Judge Caprio's gentle request hung in the air. Marcus looked up at the judge towering above him from the bench, then glanced back at his grandmother, whose encouraging nod gave him the courage to speak. His voice, small and trembling at first, began to fill the silent space with a story that would change everyone present. "I couldn't breathe, Your Honor," Marcus began, his words barely above a whisper. "It felt like someone was sitting on my chest, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get enough air." His hands moved instinctively to his chest, as if the memory itself was constricting his breathing again. Judge Caprio listened with the attention most people reserve for their closest friends. He didn't interrupt, didn't check his watch, didn't shuffle through papers. Instead, he gave Marcus something precious and rare in a legal system built on efficiency, his complete, undivided attention. "My grandmother," Marcus continued, his voice growing slightly stronger, "she saw me turning blue, and she got really scared. She grabbed me, and we ran to the car, and she kept saying, 'Hold on, baby, hold on.' She was crying, but she was trying not to let me see." Maria Santos stood beside her grandson, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks as she relived that terrifying day. She had carried the guilt of that parking ticket for months, not because of the money, but because she feared she had done something wrong in her desperation to save Marcus's life. Judge Caprio's expression softened further as Marcus continued his story. This wasn't the first time the judge had encountered families caught between emergency situations and city regulations. But there was something about this 12-year-old's earnest recounting that struck directly at his heart. "When we got to the hospital, all the parking spaces were full," Marcus explained, his small hands gesturing as he spoke. "Grandma Maria drove around twice, but I was getting worse. I was really scared, and she was scared too. She told me later that she had to choose between finding a parking spot and getting me help right away. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning cycling on. Even the court officers, who had seen thousands of cases, found themselves leaning in to hear every word. This wasn't just testimony. It was a window into the impossible choices that poverty and crisis force on families every day." Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, processing what he had heard. In his decades on the bench, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between manipulation and genuine hardship, between excuses and explanations. What he saw in Marcus and Maria Santos was authenticity in its purest form. No dramatics, no attempts to curry favor, just a boy and his grandmother telling their truth. "Marcus," Judge Caprio said, his voice carrying a tone that somehow managed to be both judicial and paternal, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully about your answer." The boy nodded solemnly, his eyes fixed on the judge who had shown him more kindness in 5 minutes than the legal system typically offers in a lifetime. "If your grandmother hadn't parked where she did that day, if she had spent time looking for a legal parking space while you were struggling to breathe, what do you think might have happened?" Marcus considered the question seriously, his young mind grappling with a hypothetical that was actually quite real. I think I might have gotten worse, Your Honor. Maybe really bad worse." Judge Caprio nodded slowly. "And what do you think is more important, Marcus? Following a parking rule or making sure you could breathe?" "Making sure I could breathe," Marcus answered without hesitation. "I agree with you completely," Judge Caprio said, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, Marcus allowed himself to smile. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. He turned his attention to Maria Santos, who had been watching this exchange with growing amazement. "Ma'am, in all my years on this bench, I've seen many people come before me with parking tickets. I've heard every excuse you can imagine. But what you did that day wasn't about breaking a rule, it was about saving a life." The judge paused, looking out over the courtroom where dozens of people waited for their own cases to be called. Many of them had been half listening to other proceedings, but Marcus's case had captured their complete attention. Several people were wiping away tears. "You know what I see when I look at this case?" Judge Caprio continued, his voice rising slightly so everyone could hear. "I see a grandmother who made exactly the right choice. I see a young man who understands that sometimes life forces us into impossible situations. And I see a parking ticket that should never have been issued in the first place." With that declaration, Judge Caprio reached for his gavel, but not to render a traditional judgment. Instead, he did something that would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms and news broadcasts around the world. "Case dismissed," he announced firmly. "Not reduced, not suspended. Dismissed completely." And furthermore, he added, looking directly at Marcus, "I want you to know that your grandmother is a hero, and you are a brave young man." The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause. Court officers who maintained professional composure as a matter of training found themselves clapping. Other defendants waiting their turns joined in. Maria Santos collapsed into tears of relief, while Marcus stood straighter than he had in months, finally understanding that justice could indeed be compassionate. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished with his acts of kindness that day. What he did next would cement his reputation as America's most compassionate judge. As the applause died down in Judge Caprio's courtroom that day, something profound had shifted, not just in the lives of Marcus and Maria Santos, but in the understanding of everyone who witnessed this moment of judicial compassion. The case that began with a frightened 12-year-old boy and an unpaid parking ticket had become a masterclass in the difference between justice and mercy, between following rules and following conscience. Judge Frank Caprio's handling of Marcus's case wasn't an anomaly in his career. It was emblematic of an approach to justice that had made him beloved worldwide. For over 3 decades on the bench in Providence, Rhode Island, Judge Caprio had consistently demonstrated that the law serves people, not the other way around. His courtroom became a place where humanity wasn't checked at the door, but was instead invited to sit at the table alongside legal precedent and municipal codes. The video of Marcus's case, captured by the court's cameras and later shared online, would eventually be viewed by millions of people across the globe. Comments poured in from every continent, in dozens of languages, all expressing the same sentiment. Finally, a judge who understands that real justice requires both head and heart. The story was translated into Spanish, Portuguese, French, Arabic, and Mandarin, spreading far beyond its Rhode Island origins to touch hearts in Sao Paulo, Lagos, Mumbai, and countless other cities, where people recognized universal truths about compassion and fairness. But the impact of that day extended far beyond viral video fame. For Marcus Santos, Judge Caprio's decision represented something more valuable than the dismissed fine. It was a lesson in how power can be wielded with kindness, how authority can be exercised with empathy. In the weeks that followed, Marcus's asthma attacks became less frequent, not because of any change in medication or environment, but because the stress that had been weighing on his family had been lifted by an act of judicial grace. Maria Santos returned to work with a renewed faith in the system she had feared. She began sharing Judge Caprio's story with other families in her community who faced similar struggles, encouraging them to believe that sometimes, just sometimes, the powerful listen to the powerless. Her small apartment became an informal counseling center where neighbors came to talk through their legal troubles, armed with the knowledge that compassion existed even in courtrooms. Judge Caprio's approach to cases like Marcus's reflected a judicial philosophy that had been decades in the making. Born to Italian immigrants in Providence, he understood personally what it meant to navigate systems that weren't designed with your circumstances in mind. His father had worked construction, his mother had cleaned houses, and young Frank had learned early that hard work and good intentions didn't always protect families from life's unexpected challenges. Throughout his career, Judge Caprio consistently chose restoration over retribution, understanding over punishment. His courtroom became famous not for harsh sentences, but for creative solutions. He had ordered teenagers caught vandalizing to help beautify the neighborhoods they had damaged. He had connected struggling families with social services instead of simply imposing fines they couldn't pay. He had treated veterans with the respect their service deserved, often dismissing minor violations with expressions of gratitude rather than judicial scolding. The Marcus Santos case epitomized Judge Caprio's belief that every person who entered his courtroom deserved to be seen as a complete human being rather than just a case number. He understood that behind every violation was a story. Behind every fine was a family. Behind every legal trouble was a person trying to navigate a complex world with imperfect information and limited resources. Legal scholars who studied Judge Caprio's methods often noted that his compassionate approach didn't undermine the law, it enhanced it. His courtroom had lower recidivism rates than comparable jurisdictions, not because people feared his punishments, but because they respected his fairness. When people feel heard and understood, they're more likely to comply with legal expectations voluntarily rather than simply avoiding getting caught. The broader impact of Judge Caprio's career, exemplified by his treatment of Marcus and Maria Santos, challenged fundamental assumptions about how justice should be administered. In law schools across the country, professors began showing videos of his court sessions to illustrate how legal knowledge could be combined with emotional intelligence to create better outcomes for everyone involved. Marcus's case also highlighted the intersection of poverty and legal vulnerability that Judge Caprio had spent his career addressing. The parking ticket that brought them to court represented a common scenario where economic hardship transforms minor violations into major family crises. By dismissing the fine, Judge Caprio wasn't just showing mercy to one family. He was making a statement about the values that should guide our legal system. Years later, Marcus Santos would graduate from high school with honors, his college applications including an essay about the day a judge taught him that authority could be exercised with kindness. Maria Santos would frame the news clipping about their case and hang it in her living room, where it served as a daily reminder that good people exist in positions of power. Judge Caprio's legacy extends far beyond individual cases or viral videos. He demonstrated that it's possible to maintain respect for law and order while never losing sight of law and order's ultimate purpose, to serve human flourishing. His career proved that justice without compassion is merely revenge with better paperwork, while compassion without accountability is meaningless gesture. In a world often characterized by cynicism about institutions and those who lead them, Judge Frank Caprio reminded us that individual character can transform systemic problems. His courtroom became a beacon of hope, a place where people learned that being vulnerable didn't mean being victimized, where admitting mistakes didn't guarantee punishment, where asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness. The story of Marcus Santos and Judge Caprio touches millions because it represents what we wish our institutions could be: fair, compassionate, and fundamentally human. It reminds us that behind every law is a choice about what kind of society we want to create, and behind every judicial decision is an opportunity to affirm human dignity or diminish it. Judge Caprio chose affirmation, chose compassion, chose to see Marcus not as a case to be processed, but as a child to be protected. That choice, multiplied across thousands of cases over decades of service, created a legacy that will inspire judges, lawyers, and citizens long after his retirement from the bench. This was just one case among thousands, but it perfectly illustrates why the world came to know Frank Caprio as America's kindest judge. He reminded us that justice isn't only about laws, it's about humanity. And that understanding, that fundamental recognition of our shared vulnerability and dignity, remains his greatest gift to all of us who witnessed his extraordinary career. Thank you for watching this tribute to Judge Frank Caprio. If his story touched you, please share it with others so his message of kindness and fairness can continue to inspire the world. In a time when compassion in our institutions feels rare, Judge Caprio proved that one person's commitment to human dignity can light up the darkness for millions.